For centuries, war had been waged on the ground. Back and forth across continents, great armies would fight and endeavor to gain superiority through better weapons and strategic maneuvers. With the coming of the great ships, war on the high seas came into being. Vast empires were built by countries who could transport their troops long distances and support them with powerful ships loaded with ammunition. But to fly, to be able to travel great distances through the air and rain terror down upon your adversaries, was the secret dream of many great military men. Since the time of Alexander the Great, military commanders must have looked to the sky and wished for a way to fly into the air and be able to see what their enemy was planning. It remained for Orville Wright and his brother to point the way. On December 17, 1903, at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, Orville Wright won the flip of a coin and a trip to immortality. With 2 bounces, he was in the air, where he hovered for 12 seconds at 31 miles per hour, covering 120 feet. But there were other early flying machines. Some that taxied, and some that hopped, some that didn't do much of anything, and some that caused havoc. In 1907, the Army recognized the potential of aviation, and in 1909 purchased the first military plane. The U.S. Army Air Service was founded under the supervision of the Chief Signal Officer. Early on, his pilots were assigned the task of testing and improving the piano wire and canvas airships. They flew test after test. Not all of the flights were successful. The first man to die in a plane crash was an Army lieutenant. But as they learned, they implemented new and better designs. Planes kept getting bigger. By 1910, unknown Americans were building and flying amphibian aircraft. Encouraged by the ever-evolving President Teddy Roosevelt to build a real Air Force, the War Department opened bids for a heavier-than-air flying machine. Signal Corps specifications required that it carry 2 persons, a distance of 125 miles, at an average speed of 40 miles per hour. The Wrights signed a stiff contract. Finally, at Fort Myer, Virginia, they flew a machine that was accepted as U.S. Army Airplane number 1. By 1913, 41 Army pilots were decorated with gold military aviator wings. Among them was Lieutenant Henry Arnold, who later, as commanding general of the AAF, led 2.5 million airmen to victory. Another aviation pioneer, Van Curtis, also built early Army trainers. Soon, more inventors improved the machine with stronger propellers. The Army began to see the new airplane emerge as a weapon. By 1914, the fledgling Army Air Service had expanded to several dozen planes. At first, planes were used only for aerial reconnaissance, but in time, bombs were added, crude and limited, but effective. And then machine guns were added. Pilots who had once waved at each other as they passed now shot to kill.
As the war begins, aviation is just brand new. I mean, you'll find that airplanes are an experiment, and they're going to use airplanes specifically to just fly out and see where people are. And so you find both sides flying airplanes around, especially in the French area, just looking for the other guy and trying to report back on his movements and where he's at and what things are doing. Because they don't have any communications. This is going to be momentary reconnaissance, and it's very personal. And you find the first combat between airplanes occurring with people shooting pistols or shotguns or whatever they can carry up in these little rickety airplanes at each other as they fly around. That's the first air-to-air combat. And so then as the war continues and airplanes evolve, then you have aircraft that are built specifically to fight, and you get some innovations like the interrupters that allow machine guns to fire through the propellers, and people begin to be concerned about survivability, how to seal fuel tanks, and some of these issues like that. And so by the end of the war, you have in fact an air war going on where they're fighting for air supremacy over the sectors of the offensives and some things like that. Another interesting thing in the early war, you actually have some bombing raids from the continent against Great Britain. And the Germans are using their Zeppelins to fly across the channel and drop bombs on London, actually. Kind of a foreplay, but it's not very effective. It just really kind of makes people angry more than anything else.
In 1915, when war truly spilled out into a world conflict with battles on many fronts ranging from German East Africa to the North Sea, the air war came into being. World War I would be the testing ground for all wars to come. Germany made the first Zeppelin raids on Great Britain in January. An Allied fleet arrived off the Dardanelles to fight Turkey. Included in the fleet was the seaplane carrier Ark Royal. It was not until 1916 that a few American-trained aviators were flying with France across the broad fields of Europe. They were the famous Lafayette Escadrille, started by Norman Prince, William Thor, Victor Chapman, and Bert Hall, who courageously fought when Germany had full control of the sky over Europe. These were the days of Baron von Richthofen's flying circus. Americans such as Billy Bishop and Eddie Rickenbacker became household names. Americans learned new words such as the Spad and the Jenny.
The differences in the systems between the different sides in their airplanes, they're really not that pronounced. They go for different things to a certain extent. You'll find aircraft are kind of one or two dimensional. You might have an airplane that's a great dogfighter, but it's really difficult to land or take off. So you find both sides evolving their airplanes, trying to find a balance between maneuverability and survivability and ease to fly, because you don't have a lot of time or effort placed on pilot training in this war. It's a seat-of-the-pants operation in terms of that, and it's reflected in the way the aircraft are built. But you have some really outstanding planes coming out. The Fokker DR-1, the famous tri-wing. You have probably the best German plane of the war, which is the Eindecker. It's a pretty good balance. It's pretty survivable. It's pretty maneuverable, and it's easy to fly. So it comes off pretty well. You have a lot of the famous Allied planes, the Sopwith Camel, the Sopwith Snipe. Some of those planes are really pretty good, but each plane has a certain aspect that it's good at. And what you find are pilots adopting a plane and using that plane to match their style of flying. And they become used to that plane, and they use that to gain a tactical edge in the air.
The advantage in the air swung from side to side throughout the war. First, the Germans with their interrupter gear, which allowed a machine gun to stop firing momentarily as the propeller flew by. Then the French and British with superior aircraft. The human factor played a large role in early aviation. A better skilled pilot with confidence in his machine could wreak havoc over an area of the battlefield. It took a special courage to fly solo with so many factors riding against you. What kind of face does courage wear in such a war? The one it has always worn. But the face of courage does not change, however much the weapons change with which the courageous man fights, or the tactics and techniques of the battle he wages. For America in World War I, that special courage, the kind summoned by the man who takes his life in his hands to do what must be done above and beyond the call of duty, were the faces of 95 brave men, 95 Americans who won the Congressional Medal of Honor. Courage in battle did find a new proving ground in World War I, the air. The airplane had barely emerged from its status as an interesting experiment, and now it was a formidable weapon of war. And the ranks of Medal of Honor winners, men who had fought on land and sea, were increased by men who wrote their records of bravery in the sky, by men such as the flying lieutenant from Ohio, who attacked 7 enemy planes, shot down 2 of them, and scattered the rest on the eve of the Argonne Offensive. When German U-boats forced the United States into declaring war, American air power was ranked 14th in the world. The American pilots were willing, but hardly ready. These rookie cadets were given wooden guns and told they were going to turn the tide. In a couple of weeks, they began to look as though they might do it. For training equipment, they molded their own bombs out of plastic. Pretty soon, they were allowed to handle the real thing, Lewis machine guns. Having met the requirements, they were issued leather flying togs and helmets. Assignments were made, and finally, they got a chance to fly. First, they made a pre-flight check of the baling wire planes. Then they tried their wings. 50 hours in the air, a few bombs, and they were checked out, ready for advanced training overseas. America was producing airmen, but they didn't have a single fighting airplane. Only a few of the American leaders were far-sighted enough to know what was needed. Men like Newton Baker, Secretary of War, was one. Woodrow Wilson, once the war looked inevitable, also saw the need for planes of all shapes and sizes. The president asked for $600 million to meet the needs of military aviation. Since congressmen bought them time, the pilots went to France without airplanes. But they did go in style. Camouflage luxury liners like the Leviathan were used as troop ships. Some of the half-trained flyers went to Britain and Italy, but most of them went to France. There they found cities of wooden barracks and muddy streets. In outdoor classes, they practiced gunnery. Wooden models helped the pilots learn how to lead a plane with gunfire. Battle-tested aviators took time out from the war to show the new recruits how to handle a stick. Finally, the pilots were allowed to solo. The first ride was always a thrill and a bumpy experience. However, it was much easier to talk about turning the tide than to produce fighting aces overnight, even if some of them were lucky. Late in the war, France met the AEF's 1st Aero Squadron headed by Major Ralph Royce. His outfit was the first to see action, and they proudly pasted paper iron crosses over enemy bullet holes. The commander was Colonel Billy Mitchell. America's first flyers were there. General Benjamin Malloy in command of Supply and School, Colonel Thomas Billing, head of Air Service Units, 1st Army, and Colonel Frank Lom for the 2nd Army. When Major William Thor and the Lafayette Escadrille became the 103rd Aero Squadron, they brought a record of triumph. Thor, 5 German planes down. Lieutenant Naylor, 3. Lieutenant Merrick, 1. Lieutenant Tolan, 3. There were many other aces, including Captain Field Kipley with 12 victories and Major Ronald Lofberry with 17, and there were those who lived to take part in another war. Captain Elliott Springs with a score of 12, and the ace of aces, Marine Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, with 26 victories. Rickenbacker was part of the famous 94th Aero Squadron. These rare film clips taken in Toul, Meurthe-et-Moselle, France on April 30, 1918, show what conditions were like for the American pilots. Here, American aviators respond to an alarm. Lieutenant Edwin Green answering an alert call. Second Lieutenant E.K. Delaney climbs into his airplane for a flight and fight above the clouds. This is Second Lieutenant Alan F. Winslow, who brought down a German plane on April 14, 1918. Douglas Campbell, who brought down a German plane on April 14, 1918. American aeroplanes leaving for the German front when an alert is sounded. This squadron was led by Flight America's top ace, Commander E.V. Rickenbacker. Near Rembercourt, Meurthe-et-Moselle, France, October 19, 1918, First Lieutenant E.V. Rickenbacker, CO, 94th Aero Squadron, attacking a German Hanover-type plane. France, October 20, 1918. A view taken while accompanying Rickenbacker in a flight over the enemy lines in a DH-4 Liberty motor plane. Rickenbacker is shown here having some fun, doing aerobatics above the clouds at an altitude of about 7,000 feet. Here, a ground crew is getting a new SPAD ready for a flight to be made by Rickenbacker. Engineer officer reading to the former mechanics of pilot Alan Winslow. The good news that Winslow is not dead, but a prisoner in Germany. Officers of the 94th Aero Pursuit Squadron, Major Huffer and Lufberry, Meurthe Moselle, April 30th, 1918. Single views of American aviators who have been decorated with the Croix de Guerre for bringing down German aeroplanes. Here is all that remains of the famous old 94th Aero Squadron. The others had been killed, captured, transferred, or sent back to the States as instructors. General Durand, commanding 8th French Army, congratulating and decorating the following American aviators: Peterson, Rickenbacker, and Lieutenant Meisner of the 94th Aero Squadron. There was a certain camaraderie among the aviators on both sides. They knew the role they were playing was a small part of a much bigger war. They also knew that the role of aviation would grow into a much larger factor in future wars. But for now, most were content to fight a gentleman's war. After shooting an enemy down, they might tip the wing of their plane to the pilot on the ground. Back at the aerodrome, tales would be spun by young men excited about being part of aviation history. Stories would be told about their exploits and their enemies. For the Allies, the most well-known German aviator was simply known as the Red Baron.
Well, the Red Baron, he's an incredible guy. And he's a reflection, if you will, of the air war as opposed to the ground war. Again, it's a small effort. It's not very big. The pilots see themselves as an exclusive club, if you will. And they see their opponents as part of that club. So there's not, in most cases, not a great animosity between them. There's the things you hear about, the saluting the fallen enemy and all those different aspects, they're all there. And there's a few exceptions to that. There's a guy named Manneke who's a Canadian-British ace who's just hates Germans, do anything to kill them. He'll go out and he's very aggressive, and for that reason, he just really, you know, it's like the old, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Well, for him, the only good German is a dead German. So, but for the most part, you find these pilots being very respectful of each other, and the Red Baron is a reflection of that. He's a technician. He's a calculating kind of combatant, as opposed to just fly into the midst of them. He's a tactician, and he uses those skills to set himself and his squadron up for a lot of these victories. No denying, though, he's an excellent pilot. Well, the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, it becomes the epitome of the air war, and he's the World War I equivalent of a superstar, if you will. He grabs the headlines, both sides, and becomes kind of a bugaboo for the Allied pilots, and he becomes a real hero for I said Axis, but it's the same kind of thing, the Austro-Hungarian-German alliance. He becomes their hero, and his victories in this stalemated ground situation, what's going on in the air becomes real important for the headlines, because it gets a little hard to report progress in inches or feet on the ground, but you have these aerial victories which capture the imagination of this generation. Boy, this aviation, this air power, that's a whole new concept. It's something to really get into. So Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, gives the Germans a propaganda edge, if you will, by being such an excellent pilot and doing so well. And again, it also avoids having to talk about the mud, the blood, and the intense casualties and the really rotten living conditions on the ground, when you can focus on the clean air. You know, boy, it's pretty clean. It's pretty surgical up there in the air. You know, when a plane crashes, it's not that bad, as opposed to what's going on the ground.
The Red Baron knew his string of victories would not last forever. He once said that he had a rendezvous with death. That rendezvous came above Austria on April 21, 1918. There, the Red Baron met with a young Canadian, Roy Brown. Though far more inexperienced, Brown held the upper hand by coming in above the Baron as he was chasing another Allied plane. Brown swooped in close, opened fire, and ripped the Red Baron's red triplane to pieces. World War I in the air was more a testing ground for World War II and future wars than for making any meaningful impact on specific battles. The evolution of the airplane in a few short years made an impression on military planners from all sides. If there was to be another war, fighter aircraft and bombers would play a much greater role.
Technical advances in World War I are an interesting story in and of themselves. You have the airplane evolving as the war goes on. They start the war with airplanes, but they evolve into something different. And you're going to see specific purpose airplanes like fighters and reconnaissance and bombers by the end of the war, when we started out at the beginning of the war with just one kind of plane, basically. And that legacy is going to carry through the interwar period into World War II. And it's going to become one of the major, the use of air power is going to become one of the major points in the interwar years of how to keep the stalemate that happened in World War I from occurring again. Use air power is the obvious solution. It's clean, it's surgical, and it's going to be a way many people are going to expect to go. It's going to bring the Luftwaffe to prominence. It's going to bring the RAF to prominence. It's going to have a lot of different proponents. Duhay and Mitchell come to mind, Mitchell being the most famous to us Americans, as proponents of air power, and the use of air power as an overwhelming weapon. Probably the tank is a technological advance that is used in World War I, and the Allies are going to use technology as a way to break the stalemate. And increasingly, they're going to look for a way to bring their technology and their manufacturing capability to bear to break the stalemate, to protect their people, and the tank is that. It's a mechanized way to move people around the battlefield with machine guns and artillery pieces and keep them protected by this armor plating. And the tank's going to be used in masses at Cambrai, and it's going to have some problems mechanically, but there's going to be a lot of for the future kind of things out there. And in the interwar years, again, you're going to see different companies or countries adopting different uses for the tanks based on their own experience. Some countries are going to go with the tank as an infantry support vehicle. We are going to take that philosophy. The French are going to take that philosophy. And other countries are going to see it as something different than that, an arm in and of itself. And that's where you're going to get the German armored force arising out of, and also the British armored force. British are going to be a leader in the advancement of mechanization in the world, kind of surprisingly. Some other technologies that show up are flamethrowers, show up for the first time, kind of a German invention. They're used, but they're used in limited scope, and it's a weapon that will be expanded and improved and carried on into the interwar years and then into World War II. You've got the use of poison gas. Use of poison gas is kind of interesting. The Germans used it against the Russians at first on the Eastern Front, and it causes some horrendous casualties, and it breaks the will of fight of some Russian divisions, and they run away. But the Russians don't bother to tell anybody that they've encountered this. So you find on the Western Front, a few months later, the Germans will spring this on the British and the French, and you have the same kind of reaction. You have a couple of French divisions break and run away. The Germans will use the gas. These guys will run away. Big hole in the line. The Germans won't have the reserves available to exploit their success. So over and over again, introduction of new technology. You have this startling break of the line, and they're not ready to capitalize on it. Or they're using limited numbers, and it gives the other side some time to prepare a response.
World War I saw the introduction of a new type of soldier, the fighter pilot, and a new concept, air superiority. From this point on, military planners would take great pains to ensure that they did everything in their power to control the skies above the battlefields. The naval history of World War I is a seldom told story. The trench warfare and the sweeping saga of nations sending their armies across the great span of Europe may be considered a far more compelling story. but the role of the navies in World War I was an important one and played a role in the outcome. For naval affairs was given great importance by the political and military leaders at the time. One of the reasons that Great Britain joined the war effort was their concern over the growing German Navy. The Kaiser had made the decision to be competitive on the world stage in regard to being a naval power and made every effort to build a large fleet. However, he was somewhat reluctant to use it once it was on the high seas.
When you talk about navies in World War I, they're on one hand, one of the primary causes of the war, because Great Britain's sitting back on this little island. Great Britain's always concerned about sea power, and so it watches very closely as the Germans begin to build a fleet, because Germany is this new country, it's a rising power, they're trying to get into the colonial race and some other things. And so the Germans begin to build this fleet and get to be number 2 in the world, and it makes the British real nervous. And so you have that. There's a weapons race prior to the war, and everybody's counting their fleets in dreadnoughts or battleships. But in the actual war itself, navies don't play a large role, except the British Navy institutes a blockade of Germany right away. And that blockade becomes telling as the war goes on. Really hurts the Germans. The German fleet is supposed to be this great counterpoint to the British. Now, they go out early in the war and they do some raiding and some things, and they get caught by the British a couple of times. They lose some capital ships. And after, let's see, the Battle of Hegel and Blight, they lose a couple of battle cruisers. And the Kaiser says, nope, time out, guys, no more risking the fleet. We can't afford to lose these capital ships that were so expensive to build. And so you find the German fleet kind of being confined to port. They'll only come out a couple more times. There are going to be some decisive fleet actions. They don't happen. The German fleet goes back, anchors, and that's the end of them. And the British fleet controls the seas after all the raiding and stuff. And then you find the Germans going to the submarine because it's been effective for them. In one afternoon, they sink 3 British cruisers with 1 submarine. They make a raid on the main British naval base in Scapa Flow that causes the British great consternation. They sink a couple battleships just by catching them somewhere where the battleships didn't expect to have any German ships, over on the Irish coast or something. They sink a couple of British battleships there. So you find as the war progresses, the only fleet out there sailing around really is the British fleet, and the Germans are using submarines and mines, either laid by surface ships or laid by submarines to try and restrict the movement of the British fleet. Well, then you have the Pacific, by the way, and you have the Japanese using their fleet to take over German colonies and some things like that, but there are not a lot of fleet actions. Early in the war, first year of the war, you have a lot of cruiser raiding kind of things going on with the German fleet that's still out, and the British are out with their cruisers trying to track them down and finish them off. And you have the Goeben, which sails through the Mediterranean ostensibly because the British hadn't declared war yet. You have the British ships and the German ships sailing by each other with guns trained, and everybody's hand on the trigger, but nobody shoots because it's not official until midnight. This is in the afternoon. So the Goeben and its sister ship will sail into Turkey and become part of the Turkish fleet and will allow them to take control of the Black Sea.
In 1914, the British were still the most powerful naval force in the world. Their famous saying, "The sun never sets on the British Empire," meant that they had to support their armies around the world with supplies and ammunitions. Their navy at the time of the outbreak of hostilities included 22 dreadnoughts in service, 13 dreadnoughts under construction, 9 battle cruisers in service, 1 battle cruiser under construction, 40 pre-dreadnoughts, 34 armored cruisers, 52 protected cruisers, 15 scout cruisers, 21 light cruisers, 220 destroyers, 109 torpedo boats, 73 submarines. The German Navy consisted of 15 dreadnoughts in service, 5 dreadnoughts under construction, 5 battle cruisers in service, 3 battle cruisers under construction, 22 pre-dreadnoughts, 7 armored cruisers, 17 protected cruisers, no scout cruisers, 16 light cruisers, 90 destroyers, 115 torpedo boats, 31 submarines. The French were not even in the same league as Germany or England. At the start of the war, they had 2 dreadnoughts in service, 14 pre-dreadnoughts, 6 old model dreadnoughts, 9 protected cruisers, 20 armored cruisers, 81 destroyers, 175 torpedo boats, 70 submarines. Most of the French fleet was too old for active engagement and were used primarily for local defense. The Austrians were just beginning to build up their force. Archduke Ferdinand, who had just been assassinated, was an ardent supporter of the Navy. While small, it was seen as a complement to the German Navy. The Austrians had 3 dreadnoughts in service, 6 pre-dreadnoughts, 3 semi-dreadnoughts, 3 protected cruisers, 2 armored cruisers, 18 destroyers, 25 torpedo boats, 5 submarines. The United States Navy in the summer of 1940 was still under construction, but it had a decent start, and being a rich country, great potential. Their Navy consisted of 10 dreadnoughts in service, 23 pre-dreadnoughts, 20 protected cruisers, 12 armored cruisers, 50 destroyers, 22 torpedo boats, 18 submarines. Other nations, including the Russians, Greece, and Turkey, had smaller navies that were of little consequence on the high seas. While much of the naval action occurred in the North Sea between Germany and England, the Gallipoli campaign on the Turkish coast was worthy of note because it was a sea and land battle that almost turned the tide of the war. It started as a naval bombardment, and the land battle continued to be directed by the theater commander aboard ship. It was a classic example of what might have happened if things had gone just a little differently.
Well, the Gallipoli campaign, it's not really a battle, it's a campaign, is all about the Dardanelles and opening a supply line through Turkish-controlled real estate to the Russians to help them stay in the war, to provide them the war material and things that they need to stay in the war, to keep them going. And it's an effort by the Allies, specifically the British, to do that. So they form a fleet and they create this expeditionary force, and it's all peripheral from the main action. You find the main British fleet staying at home to blockade the German fleet. So it's a scratch effort by the British to pull these ships in from other parts of the world. It's a scratch effort to find the troops. That's why the Anzacs show up and some other people in this conflict. And you have a two-phased operation. There's the sea phase and then the land phase. And you have the British fleet commander going in, and they're trying to bombard the Turkish forts and shore batteries into submission. And they go in and they're shooting, and it goes on for 2 or 3 hours, and the British are really doing well. They're silencing the Turkish guns, and then you have an incident where they run into an unexpected mine belt, and they lose 3 battleships. They're all old ships, and they're not really significant, if you will, in terms of naval balance of power, but he loses 3 ships very quickly in a very rapid succession. And this causes the British fleet commander a great deal of concern. They get another ship badly damaged by gunfire, and he pulls the fleet out because he doesn't think he can risk it anymore. And there's a lot of criticism of that decision to pull out just at the moment when he had the Turks on the ropes. But it's all hindsight. He didn't know that they were doing that well. He didn't realize what was going on. But that probably is the critical point at which Gallipoli is going to fail. Then you have the land phase of the operation. The Brits go in with a couple of divisions and they land on the coast, and they're going inland, and that's against some pretty tremendous Turkish resistance. There's some pretty horrendous casualties. But the British go ahead and they go on inland. So the British land commander is still on the naval vessels, and he's trying to control this attack from the Navy. Now you have to remember that they don't have modern radios, they don't have telephones, they don't have the communications that would make this an easy thing to do. So he's operating with signal flags and semaphore and flashing lights, and it's not working too well. And so you have the assaulting British divisions after this pretty horrendous conflict right on the beach, where they force the Turks back and they get right up to the high land, their objective, and they stop to brew tea. And by the time they're done having tea, the Turks have occupied the heights and they fall short of their objectives. And so they have become stalemated on the ground. They're never going to take those hills. They lost their opportunity. And then the second part of that is the Anzac landing comes in, and they're kind of sent to do some other work, and it becomes a mini Western Front. They get stalemated, they get butchered, it turns into the same kind of thing. The only aspect is they're being supplied by sea and supported by naval gunfire. So it's an interesting battle, and it's one of those great what-ifs, because what if they would have forced the Straits? What if they'd taken those heights? Then they could have controlled the Dardanelles, they could have supplied the Russians. You might never have lost the Russians in the war, you might never have had the revolution that goes on. So it's an interesting, fascinating battle, but they fail.
Men from throughout the British Commonwealth fought bravely at Gallipoli, as they did in many other places during the war. The ANZACs, short for the Australian and New Zealand Corps, fought a two-front war, one against the Central Powers and another against the prejudice of the British troops.
Well, the British and the Australians, the British and the Commonwealth at large, they're not seen as equals. It's a whole different time frame. You got to remember, on our modern ideas about Australia and the relationship with Great Britain are out the window. Australia was a penal colony, and the British looked at the Australians as criminals or sons or offspring of criminals, and so they weren't necessarily as important to them. The Anzacs become important to them, but you'll notice where they're used. They're not used on the Western Front. They're used in East Africa. They're used in Gallipoli. They're used in the Middle East. And so they're kept away from the important theater of war, if you will, and they're used in these other roles to replace British troops, if you will. So is there animosity between the two? Yes, because the British look down a little bit on the Australians, and the Australians are much more informal than their British brethren. So there is some animosity, there's a little bit of tension, but it doesn't seem to stop them from fighting real well.
The war at sea was often one of containment, keeping the enemy from receiving much-needed supplies. But one area where naval forces would make great strides was in naval aviation. The building of bigger and bigger aircraft carriers would begin in earnest as soon as the war ended. The war America entered in 1917 was a new kind of war. The truck and the tank and the machine gun had come, and combat was never to be the same again. The world would never be the same either. What emerged from the trenches and beaches and battlefields of Europe was in every respect a new world order. This was not the end. In many ways, it was just the beginning. Certain men would see to that. Almost before the ink dried on the peace papers, military leaders were planning and positioning themselves for the next war they knew was sure to come.